The Angora goat we have here in New Zealand today is an animal that's derived from a goat that occurred in Turkey in historic times. It's developed to quite a different animal in the sense that it's much more productive, a much bigger animal, a more commercially viable proposition than was found way back in days of yore when they had a few in each house and treated them very much like members of the household and used them for spinning and just domestic use. With the advent of the Industrial Revolution, large numbers of goats were farmed in Turkey, Texas and South Africa particularly, but in our two countries, Australasian countries, they failed to make much of a foothold, and the industry became very, very commercial, and the demand for mohair was huge, particularly through the 20s when velvet plush and things of like ilk were much sought after. In 1904, at Marahimo, which is down near Mangateroto in Northland, the government set up an experimental station there to carry out a trial on blackberry control. And the farm there was stocked with Angora goats and other goats, I believe. But the Angoras were sold off because they weren't suitable, mainly because they got their fleeces tangled in the blackberry, and were shipped north to Helena Bay. En route, there were escapes, and these became the foundation of the famous Waipu Angoras in the hills at the back of Waipu in Northland. The then Superintendent of Lands and Survey was a gentleman by the name of Jim Wickens, and he was responsible for the importation of several bucks from Australia, which were used to try and improve those original Waipu Angora goats. They were used by the Lands and Survey as well as their own bucks, and thus began the Lands and Survey's flock. These goats bred up in quite large numbers, and they were able to sell bucks to the industry in the late 70s and through into the mid-80s to kickstart the Angora industry here in New Zealand. We probably needed to move on from the Australasian genetics, and to that end, sallies were made forth to find goats in other countries which had superior production levels and better quality mohair. New Zealand chose to go to South Africa. These goats were brought into quarantine here in the late 80s and released from quarantine in the mid-90s, and at the same time goats from Texas were imported into Australia, and that enabled us to access both the superior genetics from Texas and South Africa at that time. The effect of that was to create a vastly improved goat with greater fleece production and better Kemp levels, lower Kemp levels than we had enjoyed previously. The market, unfortunately, in New Zealand ran into a glitch at that time. The share market collapsed, the government changed the livestock taxation rules, and goat farming became seen as something that had had its day. The reality of it is, however, that based on the production potential of the Angora goat, that the viability of goat farming has never been better. And with animals currently at realistic purchase prices, one can now get started and farm Angoras in a way which was never possible before. We have good production levels, good quality fibre, and animals available.